March 19, 1945. The cobblestone streets of Pinney, Lower Saxony, 40 kilometers east of Hanover. Major Tilo von Trot Susz stands in the darkness outside the town's military headquarters. A decoded teletype message from Wehrmacht High Command, crumpled in his fist. The order is explicit. Defend Pinney to the last man. Prepare all bridges, rail infrastructure, and industrial facilities for immediate demolition. Civilian evacuation is forbidden. Movement of population aids enemy advance. Around him, the town sleeps. 2,000 civilians, elderly men, women, children, unaware that in 7 hours American artillery will begin ranging fire on their homes. Unaware that Nazi doctrine requires their presence as human shields to complicate Allied targeting decisions. Unaware that the bridges they cross daily to reach water pumps have been wired with 500 kilograms of high explosive that will detonate the moment American reconnaissance elements appear on the eastern approaches. Every regulation demands compliance. Every oath sworn to the Führer requires obedience. Every military legal code threatens execution for commanders who refuse lawful orders during wartime. But tonight von Trot is calculating a different equation, one that weighs military protocol against civilian mortality. That measures personal honor against collective survival. That transforms a simple yes or no command decision into the most complex moral mathematics a Wehrmacht officer can face. The Americans will be here by dawn. The demolitions are prepared. The civilians are trapped, and von Trot has perhaps 6 hours to commit either the greatest act of military insubordination in his career or the greatest betrayal of basic humanity. Sometimes obeying orders isn't courage. It's cowardice dressed in the comfortable armor of regulations. And sometimes the only way to preserve honor is to destroy it in the eyes of everyone who will judge your actions by the rules you've chosen to break. Major Tilo von Trot Susz had arrived in Pinney on March 12, 1945, with orders that transformed garrison commanders into executioners of Germany's scorched earth desperation. At 34 years old, von Trot represented the contradictory face of the Wehrmacht officer corps in the war's final months. A professional soldier trained in precise tactical doctrine, but also an educated man who understood that the war was mathematically unwinnable and that each day of continued resistance only multiplied civilian suffering without altering strategic inevitability. His family background complicated everything. His cousin, Adam von Trot Susz, had been executed in August 1944 for participation in the failed July 20th plot to assassinate Hitler. That connection had placed Tilo under intense Gestapo scrutiny, but had somehow not resulted in arrest or dismissal from military service. Now, 9 months later, he faced his own moment of decision about whether obedience to the regime was worth the cost it demanded. The orders he received upon assuming command reflected the Nazi regime's final strategic calculus. Hitler's Nero Decree, issued on March 19th, this very day, mandated destruction of all infrastructure that might be useful to the enemy. Bridges, railways, communications facilities, industrial plants, food stores. The underlying philosophy was apocalyptic. If Germany could not win the war, then Germany itself should be destroyed rather than surrendered intact. Pinney held tactical significance that explained the stringent defense orders. The town straddled critical rail lines connecting the Ruhr to Berlin. 3 bridges crossed the Fuß River, providing routes American armor could use to bypass more heavily defended positions. Several small armaments factories continued producing ammunition despite Allied bombing. From a purely military perspective, Pinney warranted exactly the scorched earth measures Hitler's decree demanded. The 2,000 civilians remaining in Pinney by mid-March represented those who had either chosen not to evacuate or lacked means to flee westward. Elderly men too old for military service, women whose husbands were dead or missing, children who had known nothing but war. The town's demographics reflected the hollowing out of German society. The vital and mobile had already been absorbed into the war effort or had fled, leaving behind those least capable of surviving the combat that German defensive doctrine now invited into their homes. Von Trot had spent his first week executing the technical preparations his orders demanded. Combat engineers wired the 3 bridges with enough explosive to drop their spans into the river. Rail junctions were prepared for demolition. Armaments factories had their machinery booby-trapped. Defensive positions were established in buildings commanding key streets. positions that used civilian structures for cover and concealment, guaranteeing that American artillery would impact residential areas. But the human element created moral friction that military protocols never adequately addressed. The bridges scheduled for demolition were the same structures civilians used daily to access water pumps and food distribution points. Destroying them would trap civilians between the river and approaching American forces, eliminating escape routes and ensuring that fighting would occur in densely populated areas where non-combatant casualties would be inevitable. Lieutenant Werner Kessner, von Trot's executive officer, had raised the evacuation question during initial planning. Standard procedure called for clearing civilians from combat zones, but Wehrmacht High Command had been explicit. Civilian evacuation was forbidden. The stated rationale was that civilian movement would clog roads needed for military traffic. The unstated calculation was more cynical, civilian presence complicated. American tactical decision-making and forced them to use cautious methods that reduced operational tempo. Von Trot had read these orders with growing comprehension that he was being ordered to use civilians as tactical assets, human shields whose presence would be weaponized. The realization transformed his military service into something approaching active participation in systematic atrocity. German soldiers defending Germany could claim moral justification. German officers deliberately trapping civilians in combat zones had crossed into territory where military necessity became indistinguishable from criminal disregard for civilian life. The mathematical realities provided cold clarity. Von Trot commanded approximately 180 soldiers, Wehrmacht infantry, Volkssturm militia, and teenage Hitler Youth conscripts. This garrison faced elements of the U.S. Ninth Army with overwhelming advantages in artillery, armor, air support, and trained infantry. The defensive equation was brutal. Von Trot's garrison might delay the American advance by 12 to 18 hours. This delay would cost perhaps 60 to 80 German casualties, 40 to 70 American casualties, and an estimated 200 to 400 civilian deaths from artillery fire, building collapses, and urban combat chaos. The bridges would be destroyed, factories demolished, and Americans would control Pinney anyway after 18 hours of combat. The town would be devastated and hundreds of civilians dead. The strategic value of this 18-hour delay was approximately zero. The American advance toward the Elbe would not be meaningfully affected by one day's delay at a minor town in Lower Saxony. The war's outcome was already determined. Germany's collapse was a mathematical certainty. Every competent officer understood this by March 1945, even if speaking such truths invited charges of defeatism. Von Trot had served long enough to recognize the difference between military necessity and military nihilism. Defensive operations that traded space for time to protect critical assets served rational purposes. Operations that sacrificed soldiers and civilians purely to demonstrate ideological commitment served no purpose except multiplying suffering without altering outcomes. During evening discussions away from subordinates and party officials, both Von Trot and Kessner wrestled with questions that had no satisfactory answers within military regulations. If we defend according to orders, Kessner observed on March 18th, we kill civilians to delay an advance that cannot be stopped. If we refuse, we violate every oath and likely face execution for treason. There is no decision that doesn't involve betraying something, Von Trot responded. Our orders, our consciences, or our own survival. The technical aspects of civilian endangerment revealed the systematic nature of the policy. The Herzberg Bridge, wired for demolition, was the route civilians used to access the town's main water pumps. Destroying it would immediately create a humanitarian crisis as 2,000 people lost access to potable water during combat. Defensive positions in the town hall, church tower, apartment blocks, and primary school meant American forces would respond with artillery and airstrikes that would level buildings without requiring room-to-room clearing. Every defensive position in a civilian building designated that structure for destruction. March 19th arrived with decisions that could no longer be deferred. Morning reconnaissance confirmed American forces from the 2nd Armored Division approaching from the west, expected to reach Pinney's outskirts by early afternoon. Wehrmacht messages had grown increasingly strident. The Nero Decree made explicit what previous orders implied. Total destruction was preferable to surrender, and officers who refused would be treated as traitors. Von Trot spent the morning visiting defensive positions, gauging soldiers' understanding and willingness to execute their mission. The conversations revealed a garrison ranging from resigned acceptance among veterans, to ideological commitment among Hitler Youth, to barely concealed defeatism among older Volkssturm members. Private Hans Miller, a wounded Eastern Front veteran reassigned to garrison duty, spoke with blunt clarity. "Major, we can hold this town for maybe 12 hours if the Americans want to fight for it. Then they'll bring artillery and level every building. We'll be dead. Americans advance anyway, and civilians buried in rubble. What exactly does this accomplish?" Von Trot had no satisfactory answer within military rationale. But articulating this to soldiers would constitute defeatism punishable by execution. The Hitler Youth contingent presented a different problem. These teenagers, some 15 years old, had been indoctrinated to emphasize sacrifice and dying for the fatherland. They lacked combat experience to understand tactical hopelessness or emotional maturity to question orders. Von Trot recognized that ordering these boys to defend Pinney was effectively ordering their execution. By afternoon, the moral equation crystallized. SS security personnel and party officials began demanding visible defense preparations. Kreisleiter Hartmann, a Nazi fanatic, visited at 2:30 p.m. to personally verify that demolitions were ready and the garrison understood its duty to resist to the last man. Hartmann represented the regime's parallel authority that could denounce officers for insufficient commitment and initiate investigations resulting in execution. By 1700 hours, 5 p.m., American reconnaissance elements appeared on western approaches. Forward observers reported armor and mechanized infantry, perhaps 2,000 American soldiers supported by tanks, artillery, and air support. The tactical disparity was overwhelming. Von Trot's garrison could delay but never stop, forces with superior training, equipment, and firepower. At 18:15 hours, 6:15 p.m., Von Trot made his decision. He summoned Kestner and 3 trusted officers to a conference that would transform routine into conspiracy. "Gentlemen," he began, "we are going to refuse our orders. We are not defending Pinney. We are not detonating bridges. We are evacuating civilians and surrendering this garrison with minimal resistance. This constitutes treason under military law. We will likely face execution if discovered before we execute. You are free to decline without prejudice." After 10 seconds of silence, Kestner responded, "Major, we're with you. These orders accomplish nothing except killing civilians and soldiers for a lost war. What do we need to do?" The operational plan required systematic attention to detail, while maintaining security to prevent premature discovery by party officials. Von Trot and his officers developed a 4-phase plan to unfold over 12 hours. Phase 1. Civilian notification. 1900 hours to 2300 hours, 7 p.m. to 11 p.m. Trusted soldiers would inform civilians that evacuation would be permitted despite official orders, that they should prepare to move with whatever possessions they could carry, and that the garrison would not defend Pinney. This required absolute operational security. Premature disclosure to party officials would result in immediate intervention. Phase 2. Neutralization of party officials. 2300 hours to 2400 hours, 11 p.m. to midnight. Nazi party officials and the SS personnel would be detained in the headquarters building under pretext of final defense coordination. This constituted direct defiance of party authority and crossed from military insubordination to political resistance. Phase 3. Bridge security and demolition prevention. 2400 hours to 300 hours, midnight to 3 a.m. Combat engineers would remove demolition charges under cover of final preparations, but not detonate them. Bridges would remain intact for both civilian evacuation and American crossing. Phase 4. Mass evacuation and surrender. 300 hours to 700 hours, 3 a.m. to 7 a.m. Civilians would evacuate across intact bridges westward, away from approaching Americans toward Allied-controlled areas. Simultaneously, Von Trot would dispatch negotiators to arrange garrison surrender with minimal combat. Phase 1 began at 1900 hours, 7 p.m., as trusted soldiers moved through Pinney, informing civilians of impending evacuation. Initial reactions ranged from relief among those who understood they were trapped, to suspicion among others, fearing this might be a test by party officials. Soldiers explained that Major von Trot had prioritized civilian survival over military resistance, that the garrison would not defend the town, and civilians should prepare to evacuate during early morning. Frau Elisabeth Koenig, a widow whose husband died on the Eastern Front, lived with her elderly mother and young daughter in an apartment building designated as a defensive position. When soldiers informed her of planned evacuation, her reaction captured civilian desperation. "You're saying we can leave? The garrison won't force us to stay during fighting?" "Major von Trot is refusing defense orders," the soldier explained. "He's evacuating civilians and surrendering the garrison. Be ready to move by 3 a.m. The relief on Frau Koenig's face was followed by different fear. If he's refusing orders, won't they execute him? The soldier had no comfortable answer. "Probably, ma'am. But at least you and your daughter will survive." Phase 2 began at 2300 hours, 11 p.m., with detention of party officials who would otherwise interfere. Kreisleiter Hartmann and 3 Nazi functionaries were summoned to headquarters under pretext of final coordination. Upon arrival, they were placed under guard. Hartmann's reaction combined outrage with incomprehension. "Major von Trot, you cannot detain party officials. I demand immediate release." Von Trot's response represented the culmination of days of calculation. "Kreisleiter Hartmann, I am refusing orders to defend this town. I am evacuating civilians and surrendering this garrison to American forces. You and other officials will remain under guard to prevent interference. You are free to report my actions after civilians are evacuated, and surrender is complete." The officials' protests continued until they recognized their detention was not negotiable. They were confined to a guarded room where they could neither communicate with higher authorities nor interfere, with operations proceeding in direct violation of Hitler's directives. Phase 3 required technical precision. Combat engineers who had spent days preparing bridges for demolition now reversed their work, carefully removing explosive charges and detonators while maintaining the appearance of final preparations. The demolition systems had been designed for reliable detonation with redundant firing circuits that now had to be systematically dismantled without triggering accidental explosion. Sergeant Otto Becker, the senior combat engineer, had initially questioned whether removing charges violated his oath, but von Trot's explanation provided context that transformed the mission into civilian rescue. "Sergeant, those bridges are the civilians' evacuation route and their access to water. If we detonate them, we trap 2,000 people in a combat zone with no escape. I need you to disable the charges." Becker nodded slowly. "Major, if I do this, I'm committing treason, same as you. But I've spent this war blowing up bridges. Maybe it's time to save one. Give me 2 hours." By 1:30 a.m., all 3 bridges had been secured with demolition charges removed and stored safely. The structures remained intact, providing routes civilians needed for evacuation and that American forces would use to cross the Fuse without combat. Phase 4 began at 3 a.m. as soldiers guided civilians toward evacuation assembly points near intact bridges. Approximately 2,000 people, elderly men, women, children, sick and injured, gathered in pre-dawn darkness with whatever possessions they could carry. The organized military supervision provided structure that spontaneous refugee movements lacked. Soldiers guided civilians along safe routes, helped those with difficulty walking, and maintained order. Von Trot watched from headquarters, understanding each civilian who crossed the bridges represented both a life saved and further evidence of his treason. The mathematical calculation was simple but profound. 2,000 civilian lives preserved in exchange for 1 military career destroyed, and possibly ended through execution. Simultaneously, Lieutenant Kessner led a team toward American lines, carrying a white flag and a message explaining the garrison's intention to surrender. The approach required careful execution to avoid being shot by sentries who might interpret movement as attack. Kessner and his team moved slowly, making intentions clear until American forward positions challenged them and accepted their explanation. The American company commander initially expressed suspicion. German garrisons had been fighting desperately across the front, and peaceful surrender seemed inconsistent with the fanatic resistance encountered elsewhere. But Kessner's explanation clarified the situation. "Your major is refusing orders to defend the town?" the American officer asked. "Correct, sir." Major von Trot determined that defending Pinney would kill civilians and soldiers for no strategic purpose. He's evacuating civilians and offering peaceful surrender. Bridges are intact. Demolitions disabled. No prepared defenses will engage American forces. The American recognized the extraordinary nature of what he was hearing. Lieutenant, your major has probably saved a lot of lives on both sides. Tell him we accept his surrender. Have your garrison assembled in the town square with weapons stacked. By 6 a.m., evacuation was essentially complete. Approximately 2,000 civilians had crossed intact bridges, moving toward American-controlled areas. The garrison of 180 soldiers assembled in the town square, weapons stacked in organized piles, waiting for American forces to formally accept surrender. American armored vehicles and infantry entered Pinney at 7:15 a.m., alert for resistance, but finding instead organized surrender requiring no combat. The scene was surreal, a German garrison town changing hands without a shot fired, bridges intact, civilians evacuated, and a Wehrmacht major who had committed career suicide to prevent unnecessary bloodshed. Captain James Morrison, commanding the American company accepting surrender, approached von Trot with respect and puzzlement. Major, I've been told you refused orders to defend this town, that you evacuated civilians and disabled bridge demolitions. That took serious courage. Von Trot's response reflected exhaustion and moral clarity emerging from decisions that violated every regulation but preserved life. Captain, courage is continuing to fight when fighting accomplishes something. What you call courage, my army will call treason. But 2,000 civilians are alive who would otherwise be dead. That mathematics is simple enough even for a soldier to understand. The formal charges brought against von Trot never resulted in trial because the rapid Allied advance and Germany's final collapse intervened before a court-martial could be convened. He spent the war's remaining weeks in American custody, neither prisoner nor collaborator, but a Wehrmacht officer who had chosen mathematical certainty of civilian survival over ideological demands of a collapsing regime. Private Miller, who had participated in civilian evacuation, later reflected on von Trot's decisions. The major understood something the fanatics never grasped. Soldiers who die accomplishing nothing haven't served their country. They've just died. Civilians who die because soldiers followed stupid orders haven't been defended. They've been murdered by military protocol. Sometimes the most courageous thing a soldier can do is refuse to fight. Frau Koenig and her family, who evacuated across intact bridges in the early morning hours of March 20th, survived the war. Years later, she described that night as the moment she understood individual moral choice retained meaning, even within a totalitarian context. Major von Trot had every reason to follow orders, she explained decades after. Following orders would have been legally correct, militarily proper, and personally safer. But he chose to save civilians instead. He understood that regulations and oaths don't eliminate the fundamental human obligation to refuse participation in unnecessary killing. The mathematics of von Trot's decision remained stark. By refusing orders, he preserved approximately 2,000 civilian lives that would otherwise have been lost during combat. He saved approximately 140 to 150 military lives, German and American, that would have been expended in a battle that could never alter strategic outcomes. He prevented destruction of infrastructure that had no military value once Americans controlled the territory. The costs he accepted were equally clear. His military career ended in acknowledged treason. His family faced potential reprisals until Germany's collapse. His personal honor, as defined by military regulations and sworn oaths, was sacrificed completely. The final lesson of Pinney was perhaps most profound and most uncomfortable for military institutions to acknowledge. Sometimes the most moral choice available to a military officer is direct violation of lawful orders. Sometimes preserving honor requires destroying it in the eyes of those who judge actions purely through obedience to regulations. Sometimes the mathematics of life and death demand that individual conscience override institutional authority, even when that override constitutes treason under military law. Von Trot had understood that defending Pinney would kill civilians and soldiers to accomplish nothing except demonstrating obedience to a regime whose directives served no purpose beyond multiplying suffering. He had calculated that civilian survival mattered more than personal survival, that life preserved through insubordination was worth more than death achieved through obedience. Pinney had won because one officer ignored orders, not through cowardice or confusion, but through moral courage that accepts personal destruction in exchange for protecting those who cannot protect themselves. The mathematics were simple. 2,000 civilians lived because one major chose treason over obedience. Sometimes the most honorable decision is the one that everyone else will call betrayal.